For more than half a century, one face defined the word epic. He carried tablets down a mountain, parted an ocean, drove a chariot through a packed arena, and stared down a world gone mad with apes in charge. Audiences knew the roles by heart. What they never got was the man underneath them, until his own children finally decided to talk. Charlton Heston spent his career playing figures the size of legends: Moses, Ben-Hur, El Cid. But according to his daughter, the truth of who he actually was at home had almost nothing to do with any of that. And when she finally said it out loud, in a national magazine, decades after his death, it confirmed something fans had wondered about for years. This is the real story of Charlton Heston, the boy from the Michigan woods who became one of Hollywood's last true icons, the marriage nobody could find a scandal in no matter how hard they looked, and the quiet, private life his children only chose to describe once both of their parents were gone. Long before there was a Charlton Heston, there was a boy named John Charles Carter, born October 4, 1923, in Wilmette, Illinois. His early years, though, weren't spent in a Chicago suburb. His father ran a sawmill, and the family lived for a stretch in the remote, heavily wooded area around St. Helen, Michigan. Out there, young John spent long days alone hunting and fishing, with almost no other children nearby. It was an unusually solitary childhood, and biographers have long pointed to those quiet Michigan woods as the place where his famously self-contained, watchful screen presence first took shape. That isolation ended hard and fast. His parents divorced when he was around 10, and the family moved back to the Chicago area. His mother remarried a man named Chester Heston, and in time the family name changed to match. The future star's name became a blend of a family surname and the name of a favorite uncle. The transition from rural solitude to a crowded suburban high school was rough. By his own later accounts, he struggled to fit in. What did help was acting. Drama offered a place to belong in a school where nothing else quite fit, and that early interest carried him to a scholarship at Northwestern University in Chicago, where he enrolled in the theater program. It was there, in a Fundamentals of Theater class, that he first laid eyes on a fellow student named Lydia Clark. According to the biography Charlton Heston, Hollywood's Last Icon by Mark Elliott, he later said he simply recognized right away that she was the one, and gave himself credit for having the sense to know it. Lydia wasn't quite so sure. She would later admit her first impression of him was that he came across as arrogant and overly self-assured, but she decided to give him the benefit of the doubt anyway. That decision turned into a marriage that lasted 64 years. Heston and Clark married on March 17, 1944, at Grace Methodist Church in Greensboro, North Carolina, just before he shipped out with the Army Air Forces. He spent roughly 2 years as a radio operator and aerial gunner aboard a B-25 bomber stationed with the 11th Air Force in the Aleutian Islands, about as far from a movie set as a person could get. After his discharge, the couple headed to New York to chase acting careers together, living on thin paychecks while both worked the stage. Heston landed Broadway roles, but the real turning point came when director Cecil B. DeMille cast him as the lead in The Greatest Show on Earth in 1952, which went on to win the Academy Award for Best Picture. 4 years later, DeMille cast him again, this time as Moses in the Ten Commandments, and that role made him one of the most recognizable faces on the planet almost overnight. Ben-Hur followed in 1959 and earned him the Academy Award for Best Actor, cementing his reputation as the definitive leading man of the big historical epic. He didn't stop there. Touch of Evil and El Cid showed a different kind of range, and later films like Planet of the Apes and Soylent Green pushed him into science fiction, proving he wasn't only capable of togas and armor. Along the way, Heston also built a reputation as one of the hardest-working men in the industry, a performer who reportedly read every script offered to him personally rather than leaving the decision to agents, and who kept detailed notes on his own performances throughout his career. He was, by most biographical accounts, someone who treated acting less like glamour and more like a craft to be studied, which is part of why he was able to move so convincingly between a soft-spoken biblical prophet, a corrupt border town detective in Touch of Evil, and a grim astronaut stranded on a planet run by apes. Few actors of his generation managed that kind of range without ever losing the audience's trust that whoever they were watching was still, somehow, unmistakably him. That kind of fame, though, came with a cost nobody puts on the movie poster. Sudden global stardom put an entirely new kind of pressure on a marriage that had been built during much leaner years. As his daughter, Holly Heston Rochelle, later explained to Closer Weekly, her father was an internationally known leading man and something of a sex symbol, and no shortage of women, famous and otherwise, made their interest in him obvious. That is, by any honest account, an enormous strain to put on any marriage, let alone one being played out under the industry's brightest lights. And yet, across a career and a life that stretched more than 5 decades in an industry famous for gossip, almost nothing ever surfaced about Heston's fidelity. In that same interview, Heston himself was quoted explaining his reasoning simply: he liked the woman he was married to too much to ever risk losing her. His biographers have backed this up, pointing to a near-total absence of tabloid rumor around the marriage, a rarity for a leading man of his stature and era. One story, later confirmed by his family, captures that loyalty in a very literal, physical form. While filming the 10 Commandments on location in Egypt, Heston was separated from a pregnant Lydia for an extended stretch, the first real separation of their marriage outside of his wartime service. Rather than simply write letters, he kept an entire illustrated journal throughout the shoot. Sketches, observations, small daily details of the desert and the production, all compiled specifically so that Lydia, thousands of miles away and unable to travel, would feel like she hadn't missed a moment of it. Holly later told Closer that her father kept the diary specifically to make her mother feel included, even from half a world away. That journal sat privately in the family for decades. It only became public once Heston's children began sharing pieces of his life after both of their parents had passed, and it's one of the clearest, quietest pieces of evidence that the devoted husband image wasn't just an image. Years before it became common for Hollywood figures to speak out on civil rights, Heston was already doing it. In 1961, he joined a picket line outside a segregated movie theater, one that happened to be showing a film he starred in at the time, which made his presence there a genuinely awkward and genuinely risky professional move. 2 years later, he accepted an invitation to march alongside Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. during the 1963 March on Washington, standing near the Lincoln Memorial on one of the defining days of the civil rights movement. His son, Fraser Clark Heston, has said publicly that taking that kind of stand carried real professional risk for a working actor at the time, in an industry where studios generally wanted their biggest stars to stay out of politics entirely. At that point in his life, Heston identified as a Democrat, and his activism in that period wasn't limited to a single afternoon on the National Mall. He lent his name and public support to a number of civil rights causes throughout the 1960s, at a moment when very few A-list movie stars were willing to risk their box office standing by wading into the era's most contentious political fights. For a man whose career depended on being embraced by mass American audiences of every background, that willingness to take a public position said something about his priorities that no press release ever could. That would change dramatically in the decades to come. Heston's activism wasn't limited to the picket line. He served multiple terms as president of the Screen Actors Guild, giving him years of direct experience negotiating on behalf of working actors and navigating the space where entertainment and public advocacy meet. By 1987, he had left the Democratic Party behind and registered as a Republican, eventually founding a conservative political action committee and campaigning for Ronald Reagan. It was a shift that startled many fans who still remembered him marching with Dr. King 2 decades earlier. The most defining chapter of that political turn came in 1998, when Heston was elected president of the National Rifle Association, a position he would hold for 5 consecutive terms until 2003. His speeches during that period grew increasingly forceful, and one moment in particular became iconic far beyond the organization itself. At the NRA's 2000 convention in Charlotte, North Carolina, Heston raised a replica flintlock rifle over his head and closed his remarks by declaring that gun control advocates would only get his firearm from my cold, dead hands, a line that instantly became one of the most quoted and most parroted moments of his entire career. 2 years later, in 2002, filmmaker Michael Moore interviewed Heston for the documentary Bowling for Columbine, pressing him on the timing of an NRA event held shortly after the Columbine High School shooting. The exchange drew heavy criticism once the film hit theaters, and some observers later argued the interview was unfair, given that Heston's private health struggles the public didn't yet know about, were already quietly underway. Interestingly, longtime friend Kirk Douglas, whose politics differed from Heston's on almost everything, publicly defended him and called the way the interview had been conducted unfair to an old friend. On August 9, 2002, Heston released a taped statement revealing that he had symptoms consistent with Alzheimer's disease. The message included a direct farewell to the public he'd spent decades entertaining, acknowledging that a day might come when he could no longer express himself the way he once had. He made one more major public appearance in July 2003, when President George W. Bush awarded him the Presidential Medal of Freedom at the White House. Not long after, he stepped down from both acting and the NRA presidency, closing out a public career that had spanned more than 50 years, from Broadway stages to biblical epics to science fiction classics. By 2005, reports described a rapid decline that reportedly shocked even close friends and family. Notably, he and former President Ronald Reagan, who shared both a political era and, tragically, the same diagnosis, had become close friends, two towering public figures from the same generation facing the same private battle at nearly the same time. Charlton Heston died at his home in Beverly Hills on April 5, 2008, at the age of 84. Lydia was by his side. The official cause was later confirmed as pneumonia. They had been married 64 years. More than 250 mourners attended a private memorial at a small parish church in Pacific Palisades, and tributes came in publicly from President Bush and figures across the entertainment industry. Lydia lived another decade, continuing her respected career as a photographer, before she died on September 3, 2018, at UCLA Medical Center, also of complications from pneumonia, at age 95. She had also survived breast cancer earlier in her life. 4 years after their parents' deaths, Fraser Clark Heston and Holly Heston Rochelle mostly stayed out of the press, letting their father's legacy speak for itself through old films and political headlines. That changed when both siblings sat down separately with Closer Weekly to talk about their parents' marriage and their father's private character, on the record, for the first time in real detail. What they described lined up with what fans had quietly suspected for years but had never actually heard confirmed, that behind the historical epics and the political controversy, Charlton and Lydia Heston had a genuinely happy, genuinely faithful, 64-year marriage. Holly was blunt about it. Despite her father's fame and the constant attention from admirers, there was, in her words, barely a whisper of gossip about infidelity, ever. Fraser added color to the picture of his father as a parent, describing him as unusually patient and present at home, someone who was, as Fraser put it, fully engaged whenever he was actually with you. Family evenings reportedly involved reading together, watching movies, and long games of Monopoly around the kitchen table. A strikingly ordinary picture for a man who spent his career playing some of the largest characters in movie history. Both children also pushed back on the public image of their father as rigid and humorless, insisting that at home he was warm, funny, and engaged, a very different man than the one audiences saw delivering NRA convention speeches. Holly also spoke about how proud both of her parents were that she and her brother had avoided the kind of public struggles so many children of major movie stars go through. And even in describing the difficult final years of her father's illness, the family's message was consistent. He had lived the life he wanted, without regret. Holly summed it up simply: there were no empty buckets left on his bucket list. From a lonely childhood in the Michigan woods, to a marriage that somehow outlasted every ounce of Hollywood temptation, to a late-in-life political transformation that still divides opinion today, Charlton Heston's real story turns out to be more complicated, and more human, than any single role he ever played on screen. His daughter's decision to finally speak openly about her parents' marriage didn't rewrite the record. It confirmed what a lot of longtime fans had already suspected, that the loudest, most commanding leading man of an entire generation spent his quietest hours being exactly what his children always knew him as, a patient father and a devoted husband, sketching in a journal in the Egyptian desert so the woman he loved wouldn't feel so far away. It's worth sitting with how unusual that combination really is. Hollywood has produced plenty of leading men who looked the part of a devoted husband on screen and lived nothing like it off of it. It has produced plenty of political lightning rods whose public battles left their private lives in ruins. Heston, somehow, managed to be a genuine object of national controversy, cheered by some, criticized sharply by others, right up until his final public appearances, while his own children describe a home life defined mostly by patience, routine, and quiet affection. Those two versions of the same man don't usually coexist this cleanly, which is probably why it took his children this long, and this much distance from the headlines, to finally say so themselves. There's also something worth noting in the timing of it all. Holly and Fraser didn't rush to share these details in the immediate aftermath of their father's death, when the industry's appetite for a tell-all would have been highest. They waited years, spoke to a single publication on their own terms, and focused less on defending his political legacy than on describing the father they actually knew, the one who sketched in a journal so his pregnant wife wouldn't feel so far away, who came home from a day of shooting a blockbuster and sat down to play Monopoly, who apparently never once gave his family a real reason to doubt him across 6.5 decades of marriage. In an industry built partly on image management, that kind of restraint is its own quiet statement. What part of Charlton Heston's story surprised you the most? Let us know in the comments, and if you enjoyed this look behind the legend, don't forget to like and subscribe for more real stories from Hollywood's golden age. Sources: Closer Weekly Interviews with Holly Heston Rochelle and Fraser Clark Heston, Mark Elliott, Charlton Heston, Hollywood's Last Icon, Wikipedia entry on Lydia Clark, contemporaneous news coverage of the 2000 NRA convention and Heston's 2002 Alzheimer's announcement.